Let's start with our prayer. Lord, your mission to the church to carry the gospel of salvation to the ends of the earth is the same mission that every professing Christian accepts in the sacrament of confirmation. In our study of the Acts of Apostles, inspire us with the stories of your faithful disciples, that we too, empowered by your Holy Spirit, might advance the gospel and your gift of eternal salvation. We pray in the name of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. In 58 AD, events in the wider world are affecting the spread of Christianity. The Roman Empire is taking notice of the rise of Christianity, and this will have both a positive and a negative effect on the spread of the gospel. Many Romans will come to believe in Christ, including many men in the Roman army. But the growth of the church and the single allegiance of Christians to Jesus Christ above the empire will begin to concern the Roman government. In Judea, there's a rising tide of Jewish nationalism that will be fueled by the injustice and violence generated by a series of bad Roman governors, the first of whom is the governor Felix, who will have an impact on St. Paul's life. And after the death of the Roman Emperor Claudius in 54 AD, the edict that banned Jews and Christians from Rome was lifted and allowed both Jews and Christians to come back and live in the city of Rome. And it was probably at this time that Aquila and Priscilla left Ephesus and returned to Rome. This is a new opportunity for Christian evangelization in Rome and in the western provinces of the Roman Empire. As you know, Paul had a desire to go to Rome for quite some time. From Luke's account of his travels in Acts and in Paul's letters to the church in Rome, we know that Paul has fully evangelized the region within the Roman provinces of Judea, Syria, Galatia, and Phrygia, Asia, and Greece, Macedonia, and into the territory on the eastern coast of the Adriatic. So he's been very busy. The churches and his missionary team that they founded are growing in numbers, and the new faith communities are being established in outlying areas from them. So Paul feels now it's time to turn the gospel mission in another direction. He writes to the Christians in Rome of his intention to visit them. However, he diplomatically denies any intention of settling there. He only intends on passing through en route to Spain and points west. In the past, he writes, he hesitated to come to Rome because this would be to build on the foundation of another man, which is probably a reference to St. Peter, who had first come to Rome in 42 AD, and now has returned with the lifting of Claudius's edict. Paul now plans to visit Rome, but first he is directed by the Holy Spirit to go to Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey. He has also prophetically a symbolic gift from the Gentiles of Asia and Greece to deliver to the holy ones in Jerusalem. He has been warned 3 times that he's going to face persecution and suffering there, but he's committed to fulfilling God's plan for his life no matter what the cost is. Before his visit to Jerusalem, Paul asked his friends to pray that he would be delivered from the disobedient in Judea, and that his ministry to the Gentiles and their gifts to the church would be acceptable to the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. Now, we can speculate as to what Paul meant by the disobedient. Did he mean those unbelieving Jews who refused to accept Jesus as the Messiah? Or was he referring to the Jewish Christians in the Jewish community of Jerusalem who are opposed to Gentiles being accepted into the new covenant of the Messiah, Jesus Christ? So we're not really sure which one he's talking about, but I think, as we saw last week, that most likely his own fellow Christians he was praying for. Paul has already experienced the tension that the Jewish Christians feel with the inclusion into the new covenant of so many Gentiles. Paul must have wondered if that tension would develop into more problems for him and his missionary team when he arrived in Jerusalem. Paul's reception by St. James and the presbyters, the priests of Jerusalem, answered that question. The church in Jerusalem believes Paul's bad reputation among the Jews will have a negative impact on their ability to continue their mission. St. James and his priests believe that the Jewish Christians are still bound by ritual laws. And they ask Paul, as a sign of solidarity with his Jewish brethren, to sponsor the fulfillment of a Nazirite vow of 4 Jewish Christians at the Jerusalem temple. Now, this is a doctrine Paul does not embrace and can only see adherence to the old law by Jewish Christians as a division between the Jewish and Gentile Christian believers. He doesn't agree with them, but he submits because the request came from James, who is the bishop of Jerusalem. He has the jurisdictional power over him. It must have been a sad moment for Paul to have to do this. So James and Paul. At this time, Paul has been an apostle to the Gentiles for about 24 years, and James has been the leader of the Jerusalem church since Peter left about 23 years earlier. Both men were completely dedicated to their apostolate, and each believed that they were called to it by God. Yet their missions were to 2 groups of people who were very different culturally, linguistically, and in their former religious traditions. Effective service to both groups meant compromise, without compromising the gospel that was preached by Jesus Christ, and without adding any further division between the 2 groups. That's important if the church was going to survive. So these 2 men who had radically different missions to very different people had to figure out a way to make it work so that they weren't dividing the church between them. Now, their meeting must have resulted in an inevitable sense of distance between the 2 holy men, who in other circumstances and in other times probably would have enjoyed a very close working relationship. Evidence of this distance is found in the fact that James apparently makes no effort to support Paul when he is attacked by the Jews of Jerusalem. No support comes from the Christian church in Jerusalem, which is everywhere else Paul was attacked, he had support of the Christian community. God warned Paul that many who loved him, that he would suffer in Jerusalem. The warning was fulfilled when a crowd of Jews attacked Paul in the temple about a week after his arrival. It took the intervention of the Roman tribune and his soldiers to save Paul's life. The tribune, however, needed to determine why the Jews were demanding Paul's life, and so the next day, wishing to determine the truth about why he was being accused by the Jews, he freed him and ordered the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin to convene. Then he brought Paul down and made him stand before them. So this is where we are from the last week, just to recap everything so we understand what is happening to Paul and to the church at this time. Now we're going to look at Paul before these Jews and still in custody. Paul looked intently at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have conducted myself with a perfectly clear conscience before God to this day." The high priest Ananias ordered his attendants to strike his mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you indeed sit in judgment upon me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law order me to be struck?" The attendant said, "Would you revile God's high priest?" Paul answered, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written, 'You shall not curse a ruler of your people.'" Paul was aware that some of the Sadducees and some of the Pharisees, and so he called out before the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. I am on trial for hope in the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the group became divided. But the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection or angels or spirits, while the Pharisees acknowledge all 3. A great uproar occurred. And some scribes belonging to the Pharisee party stood up and sharply argued, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." The dispute was so serious that the commander, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, ordered his troops to go down and rescue him from their midst and take him into the compound. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for just as you have borne witness to my cause in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness in Rome." So, Paul begins his address to the Sanhedrin by identifying himself as one of them. He calls them brothers. He tells them that the conduct of his life toward God has been without fault. The reigning Jewish high priest served as the president of the Sanhedrin when it was in session. In response to Paul's declaration, the high priest Ananias ordered his attendant to strike Paul across the face. This violent action by Ananias against Paul is certainly within his character, according to a description of him by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who would have known him as a member of the priestly community. Josephus describes him as a man who was known for his temper and his violent nature and, of course, his avarice. He gave large bribes to Romans and the Jews of influence, and he was so greedy for wealth that he confiscated the people's tithes that were meant to support the other priests of the temple. His evil deeds seem to have caught up to him in 52 AD, when the Roman governor of Syria accused him of being responsible for acts of violence among his citizens. His conduct returned, but he was acquitted. Unfortunately, they arrested him, they sent him to Rome, but his years of support for Rome and the money that he paid to the Roman officials allowed him to be acquitted by the Emperor Claudius. He returned to Jerusalem, and his conduct got even worse because of that. Probably thought, "I'm safe, you can't touch me now." So he was even worse than he was before. He left his high office as high priest in 58-59 and continued to enjoy his wealth and influence until the beginning of the Jewish revolt against Rome. He was hated by the Jewish nationalists for his pro-Roman politics, and when the war began in 66 AD, the Jewish nationalists burned down his house. He fled but was trapped while hiding in an aqueduct on the grounds of the Herodian palace, and he was murdered there. So he got his, even though he caused all this problem, so many others. So Paul said to him when he was struck, then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." Paul's curse, "God will strike you," is, according to the Mishnah, an appropriate form of cursing one who disregards the commandments of God. Jesus called the scribes and Pharisees whitewashed tombs. He was referring to their outward show of piety, while inside they were full of hypocrisy. But it's more likely that Paul is making an allusion to the prophet Ezekiel's condemnation of the Jewish leadership. Ezekiel said, "For the reason that they led my people astray, saying peace when there was no peace, and that as one built a wall, they would cover it with whitewash. Say then to the whitewashers, I will bring down a flooding rain, hailstones shall fall, and a storm wind shall break out, and when the wall has fallen, you will not be asked, where is the whitewash you spread on?" Do you understand this? You get it? What he says, what Ezekiel is saying first, and they would have known this, so Paul used the same term, whitewashed wall. So in other words, they kept putting up a front, pretending everything was good, when it really wasn't. And then when the storm or adversity comes, everything they did crumbled, and it reveals a broken wall. Yeah, so he's saying, you're a whitewashed wall. You're putting up a front, but nobody believes you. We know you're corrupt. So that was his insult to him. After cursing the high priest, Paul continues, "Do you indeed sit in judgment upon me according to the law, yet in violation of the law, order me to be struck?" Paul is accusing the high priest again of hypocrisy. He has mistreated Paul as a violator of the law before he's even heard anything about what he's done. No witnesses have come forward, nothing has been said, and immediately he's acting violently towards him. So he's breaking the law himself. Paul is outraged at this abuse of power and condemns the high priest's actions by calling on God for justice. According to the law, an accused person has the right to face his accusers and cannot be condemned unless there is testimony by 2 or 3 credible witnesses. It's the same charge St. Stephen made in Acts before. You receive the law as transmitted by angels, but you do not observe it. Where am I now? 3, 4, 5? Yeah, okay. Those who were standing near Paul said, "You dare insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Now, some might think this is an apology. No, Paul is being facetious here. When he says he did not know this was the high priest, because, of course, look at the way he's acting. Would a high priest act like this? So he's being facetious. Of course he knew it was the high priest. It's the high priest who presides over the Sanhedrin. He was high priest 8 years ago when Paul attended the Council of Jerusalem. He was the high priest when Paul last visited Jerusalem after the second missionary journey. Well, Paul means that this man is not acting with the dignity and justice of a high priest. Paul's statement is another criticism of him and his bad behavior, which makes him unrecognizable. So again, this is not an apology, because you can read some commentaries which say, well, Paul's kind of apologizing, he didn't realize, well, maybe it was a new high priest, he wasn't sure, but no, that's not it at all. Paul knows what he's doing at all times. And high priests don't just come and go. They're there for a long period of time. So, we move on. Paul was aware that some were Sadducees and some were Pharisees, so he called out before the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. I am on trial for hope in the resurrection of the dead." Now, Paul realizes it will be impossible for him to get a fair trial in this assembly. As soon as they start hitting him and cursing him, the minute he stepped in the room, he knew there was no way he was going to get a fair trial here. So the best thing he could do was disrupt it, make it impossible for them to make a judgment. So he said his fate has already been decided by them, so he makes this bold move, identifies himself as a Pharisee who believes in the resurrection, and saying that that is why he's there on trial. In bringing up this contentious point between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Paul is attempting to get the Pharisees on his side as well. So, when he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the group became divided. But the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, or angels, or spirits, while the Pharisees acknowledge all three. A great uproar occurred, and some scribes belonging to the Pharisee party stood up and sharply argued, "We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him." So Paul's plan worked. The assembly lost track of the charges that were brought against him and began to argue about the doctrine of the resurrection, about angels, spirits. So it worked. He got the Pharisees on his side, and they said, "We see nothing wrong with this man." So he split the whole thing up. But the dispute was so serious, they were so heated, that the commander, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, ordered his troops to go down and rescue him from their midst and take him into the compound. So the soldiers had to rescue him from this group, this argument that was going on with the Sanhedrin. The council's unruly. It's just like the mob that first attacked him in the temple. The same thing happening again. Once again, Romans stepped in and took him into the fortress Antonia. Now, the following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for just as you have borne witness to my cause in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness in Rome." So God is telling him this all has a purpose. It may be difficult to go through, but hang in there. It's got some meaning to it. It's going to achieve something. So he gives him encouragement, the encouragement that Paul needs, and the promise he will indeed take the gospel to Rome. This event is reminiscent of the vision Paul received of Christ after he became discouraged in Corinth. So when he became discouraged, Christ appeared to him again and told him, don't worry, this has a purpose. So, when the day came, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. So, they knew they weren't getting anywhere with this trial business, so they're going to take matters in their own hands. There were more than 40 who formed this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have bound ourselves by a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. You, together with the Sanhedrin, must now make an official request to the commander to have him bring him down to you, as though you meant to investigate his case more thoroughly. We, on our part, are prepared to kill him before he arrives. The son of Paul's sister, however, heard about the ambush, so he went and entered the compound and reported it to Paul. Paul then called one of the centurions and requested, take this young man to the commander. He has something to report to him. So he took him and brought him to the commander and explained, the prisoner Paul called me and asked that I bring you this young man to you. He has something to say to you. The commander took him by the hand, drew him aside, and asked him privately, what is it you have to report to me? He replied, the Jews have conspired to ask you to bring Paul down to the Sanhedrin tomorrow, as though they meant to inquire about him more thoroughly. But do not believe them. More than 40 of them are lying in wait for him. They have bound themselves by oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are now ready and wait only for your consent. As the commander dismissed the young man, he directed him, tell no one that you gave me this information. So there's a plot now going on to kill Paul. 40 Jews conspire with the high priest and the Sanhedrin to illegally murder Paul. Paul's nephew warns him. It was not uncommon for the Romans to grant access to prisoners by their family and friends, so that's not unusual. The Roman tribune warns the young man for his own protection not to reveal that he has given this information to him about the plot. The question that has to be asked, however, is if the young man who was Paul's nephew heard of the conspiracy, weren't there also other Jewish Christians of the church in Jerusalem who also heard it? Or was he just standing by himself somewhere and heard this plot? He was a young man, probably not out on his own. So we can assume other Christians also heard of it, but yet none of them came to warn Paul. Only this young man, because, of course, he was his nephew. And felt family, I got to take care of my family. So again, here's this issue already within the church, Christians against Christians. They're probably thinking it's better to let him die, that we don't have the problem anymore. Problem goes away. How can you certain it's not true? That's the whole thing. Because this is a young man. He makes a clear point. It's a young man. How does a young man come into information like this? Yeah, he's related to Paul, but how did he get the information? Where was he when he heard it? How do you know some of these 40 men that are conspiring with the Jews, how do you know some of them weren't Christians? See, this is the whole thing. When they say young men, they want to tell you this man is not just anybody. He's a young guy out there, obviously in the company of others. He would not be out anywhere where he could get information like this unless there was an adult or somebody with him. So it leads you to speculate. And even if this wasn't true, why isn't the Christian church helping Paul? There's no mention anywhere of them coming forward, offering money, doing anything for his cause. No witnesses come forward, nobody. It's a sad thing when you stop and think of it. So you have these two dynamos, James and Paul, And James, I don't know, he must be in agony over this. What to do, what not to do. Go on Paul's side, lose my community. Go on my community side, lose Paul, and then where are we? What happens to all those Gentile communities out there? Does that mean now we go back there and say, now you all have to be circumcised? After he signed an agreement that says they don't? It's a difficult situation. And the church is not sure what to do with this.
I know you've explained it before, but can you remind me why the number 40 is so prominent? I know there's so many mentions of 40, but
it's like 40 days on the mountain, 40 days. It's the number that achieves something. It's perfection. It's like 40 days fulfilled. So 40 of us do this, we're going to get it done.
Okay. So what was the first thing that you said that 40 is?
Fulfillment. It's going to be past. It's going to be good. It's a sort of period of time of the trust. It's going to be a good outcome. 40, like Jesus, 40 days in the desert, then he's baptized. Great outcome. Moses, 40 on the mountain, brings down the tablets. The Israelites, 40 years in the desert, they get the promised land. So it's like this is a number of power that this is going to help us achieve what we want to do. Yeah. You've got that look of perplexed on your face. I know it's hard. You don't want to believe that this early Christian community would act like this. Because we're all taught how wonderful they were. They all loved each other. They did everything for each other. Well, it's right here in the scriptures that right from the beginning, unity is a problem within this church. When you start taking the message of the gospel and trying to make it work one way over another. The message of the gospel is quite clear. Everyone is open for salvation. But for James to do that, he loses his community. He puts himself in danger. He himself is a Jew. Maybe he doesn't believe as Paul does, hasn't had that strong of a conversion that way yet. Yet he's an apostle. So it's difficult situations, and will always happen in these situations within the church, where you try to take the gospel message and usurp it one way or another, to lend credence to one thing or another, when actually it's very clear in what it is. And do you stand up for it, or you don't stand up for it? Paul's standing up for it. He's a Jew who gave up the ritual practices because he understood what Christ was offering, fulfilled the law. To cling to the law is an impediment to Christ. And we can't put that in people's way. We can't make people do what the old law says for the new law to take effect. So it's a difficult thing. These two men, as I said, must have been hard on Paul to have no Christian come forward. He's all alone. Other than, of course, he had Luke and a few of his own missionary team with him. But they have no power in this church. They're just like him. They're Gentiles, and what do? So this is a difficult thing. So we're wondering, where are they? Where are they? Are they so fearful that they support Paul and the Jews that the city will turn against them? Or they're displeased that this problem's out of their hands and they're just willing to let other people take it wherever it goes? Were Paul's missionary friends ordered by St. James not to interfere as well? Maybe, who knows? It would appear that the only men who cared about Paul's safety were his nephew and the Roman tribune. The only one. Isn't that an odd mix? That God uses just those two things to protect Paul. Because this tribune is obviously sees something here, that he's protecting Paul. And we'll see more of that as we go on. So we're going to take a break here. It's a short night because breaking these last two pieces up is hard. Next week will be a lot longer. So we'll take a little break here. We're going to look at what the fallout from this plot was now that the Roman centurion or the Roman tribune knew about it. So we come back to our scripture. Then he summoned two of these centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready to go to Caesarea by 9 o'clock from the third hour of the night, tonight, along with 70 horsemen and 200 auxiliaries. That's a pretty big group. Provide mounts for Paul to ride and give him safe conduct to Felix the governor. Then he wrote a letter with this content. Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man, seized by the Jews and about to be murdered by them, I rescued after intervening with my troops when I learned that he was a Roman citizen. I wanted to learn the reason for their accusations against him, so I brought him down to their Sanhedrin. I discovered that he was accused in matters of controversial questions of their law, and not of any charge deserving death or imprisonment. Since it was brought to my attention that there will be a plot against the man, I am sending him to you at once, and have also notified his accusers to state their case against him before you. So, he knows Paul is no longer safe in Jerusalem. So he decides to take him out of the city, but he's going to do it without giving any notice to the Jews. He sends Paul out with 470 soldiers. The number seems excessive, but apparently the tribune expects if word gets out that he's moving Paul, they may be attacked by armed Jews anywhere along the way. They will be especially vulnerable to ambush traveling through valleys, narrow trails, and ravines of the Judean wilderness. According to Josephus, the Judean wilderness was full of brigands at this time, during the governorship of Felix especially. A number of soldiers provides the Romans more than 10-to-1 odds over the 40 armed men that they know about. So he's ensuring, I've got 10-to-1, that he's going to ensure Paul's safety. Now, the Roman day began at midnight, with the 6th hour being the hour of dawn. If the tribune is referring to the 3rd hour, 9 o'clock, meaning the 3rd night watch, it began at midnight and ended at 3 in the morning. Then most of the citizens of Jerusalem would be asleep at that time and would not realize that Paul was being moved. The large number of soldiers that the tribune has ordered to escort Paul to Caesarea shows he's not taking any chances having Paul taken out of his custody. Again, there's an attachment now to Paul. He wants to protect this person. Claudius Lysias wrote a letter to be delivered to the governor, Antonius Felix, giving his reasons for sending Paul to him. Marcus Antonius Felix was the procurator of Judea. According to the testimony of Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, he was appointed governor in 52 AD. And both Josephus and Roman historian Tacitus record that he was a brutal governor during his tenure as the ruler of the province of Judea. He owed his position and his influential older brother Marcus Antonius Pallas, who served as secretary to the emperor during the reign of the Roman emperors Claudius and Nero. So he's very well protected high up. Felix's gross immorality and cruelty, coupled with his accessibility to bribes and his severity, led to unrest in Jerusalem and Judea, and increased armed resistance against the Roman occupation. He's basically the one who started the war that destroyed Jerusalem because of his cruelty and the way he acted towards the people. He left his term as procurator in 59 AD. So the soldiers, according to their orders, took Paul and escorted him by night to Antipatris. The next day they returned to the compound, leaving the horsemen to complete the journey with him. When they arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and presented Paul to him. When he had read it and asked to what province he belonged and learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I shall hear your case when your accusers arrive. Then he ordered that he be held in custody in Herod's praetorium. So Felix asks Paul what province he came from, because if Paul was under the jurisdiction of a Roman ruler who was within a reasonable distance, he would be sent to that ruler and he'd be out of his hair. But since Cilicia was so far away, Felix accepted Paul's case for judgment. Since Claudius Lysias could not determine why the Jews were accusing Paul, Felix would send for his accusers to hear testimony from both sides. Paul was to be held in Herod's Praetorium. Herod the Great built the city of Caesarea, and therefore the fortress where Roman justice was decided also bore his name. So now we have Paul captive in Caesarea. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an advocate, a certain Tertullus, and they presented formal charges against Paul to the governor. When he was called, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Since we have attained much peace through you, and reforms have been accomplished in this nation through your providential care," all bald-faced lie, "we acknowledge this in every way and everywhere, most excellent Felix, with all gratitude. But in order not to detain you further, I ask you give us a brief hearing with your customary graciousness." Very flowery beginning. "We found this man to be a pest. He creates dissension among the Jews all over the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to desecrate our temple, but we arrested him, and would have judged him according to our own law, but the cohort commander Lysias came and violently took him out of our hands and ordered his accusers to come before you. If you examine him, you will be able to learn from him or for yourself about everything of which we are accusing him." The Jews also joined in the attack and asserted that these things were so. So Tertullus was a professional orator and a legal advocate who was hired to represent the Sanhedrin's case against Paul. It's not clear if he's a Jew or a Gentile, it doesn't say, or even if he's a convert to Judaism. He probably speaks both Latin and Greek, while the Jews do not speak Latin, so they needed him to speak with the Roman governor. Latin is, of course, the native tongue of the governor. After flattering the governor, Tertullus presents the charges against Paul. He is a pest, a troublemaker. He creates dissension, not only in Jerusalem, but worldwide. He's a leader of the Nazarene religious sect, and he attempted to desecrate the temple. So that's their main argument. According to the law, to profane the Sabbath or curse the divine name of God was a death penalty as an apostate Jew who turns to worship of idols. So they knew that these particular accusations should result in Paul being put to death. That's what they're after. Other violations require excommunication. The Jews have extended the death penalty offense to include profaning the temple and contempt for the law of Moses, even though that's not found in the written law. So they're adding to it to make their case. So if you look at the written law, none of that's there. That would lead to a death penalty. So then, the governor motioned to him to speak, and Paul replied, "I know that you have been a judge over this nation for many years, and so I'm pleased to make my defense before you. As you can verify, not more than 12 days have passed since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor anywhere in the city did they find me arguing with anyone or instigating a riot among the people. Nor can they prove to you the accusations they are now making against me. But this I do admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors and believe everything that is in accordance with the law and written in the prophets." So far, so good. "I have the same hope in God as they themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous. Because of this, I have always strived to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After many years, I came to bring alms for my nation and offerings. While I was so engaged, they found me, after my purification, in the temple without a crowd or disturbance. But some Jews from the province of Asia, who should be here before you, to make whatever accusations they might have against me, they're not there, or let these men themselves state what crimes they discovered when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it was my one outcry as I stood among them that I am on trial before you today for the resurrection of the dead. Then Felix, who was accurately informed about the way, postponed the trial, saying, when Lysias, the commander, tribune, comes down, I shall decide your case. So Felix knew about the way. And so he decided, okay, we're going to stop here. He gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that he should not prevent any of his friends from caring for his needs. So Paul begins by refuting the charges brought against him, arguing that he didn't cause any kind of disturbance in the city or in the temple. Didn't bring any crowds with him. There's nothing going on. He was just there after being purified to worship as a Jew. They have no witnesses with them to back up the allegations that they've made against him. Not even the Jews from Asia who first accused him, who were the only supposedly eyewitnesses to the event. Far from profaning the temple, he came into the temple in the state of ritual purity, according to the laws of the Jews. He is a member of the way, and the purpose of this journey was to bring alms to the poor. The real reason he is on trial is because of his belief in the resurrection of the dead. So that's where he starts. After several stunning denials, though, Paul suddenly confesses that he is a member of the way, meaning the Christian community. But he worships the same God as the Jews, and he confesses his belief in the resurrection of the dead. The language of his confession is a profession of his faith. Paul's phrasing of the bringing of the money to Jerusalem as alms for my nation and offerings was probably to disguise the fact that the gift was for the church in Jerusalem. He was just saying he brought money to Jerusalem, basically what he says, for the city. That the governor was accurately informed about the beliefs of the way demonstrates that the Romans are now seeing the Christian movement as having an impact on them, in Judea especially, and that it requires their attention. So they start learning about it. It is interesting that Felix is postponing a verdict until he speaks with Lysias. He already had the letter from him saying that there's nothing, no proof, no witnesses, nothing that this man's accused of that would warrant a death sentence. So he already has more than enough evidence to dismiss all charges against Paul. He does not need the tribune to come there and tell him anything else. Felix never sends for him in any case. Paul's testimony that he brought a large sum of money to Jerusalem is probably why. The governor had the hope that members of the way who have this money would bribe him to release Paul. So again, his avarice. Oh, you have money. Well, we'll stop the trial right here. We'll just wait and see. The Christians know where you are. Let's see if they bring any money. They pay me, you can go. You see how he treated them all. So Paul was kept under house arrest, and he was permitted to see his friends. He received gifts, and he was living in comfort. Wasn't in a prison anywhere. He was actually under house arrest, but people could come and go and see him, and he was virtually living in comfort. So it's fine for him. So this is where he left it. Several days later, Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, who was Jewish. He had Paul summoned and listened to him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. But as he spoke about righteousness and self-restraint and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened, obviously. And he's thinking of himself here again. Oh, that's me he's talking about. And he said, you may go now. When I find an opportunity, I shall summon you again. In other words, you're never going to see me again. At the same time, he hoped that a bride would be offered him by Paul. And so he sent for him very often and conversed with him. 2 years passed, and Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. Wishing to ingratiate himself with the Jews, Felix left Paul in prison. So he was there for 2 years, the governorship changed, and he left Paul there because he didn't want to upset the Jews. So there's poor Paul languishing again in this place between governors now. It says here Felix's wife, Drusilla, was a Jewish princess. She was the daughter of King Herod Agrippa I and the great-granddaughter of King Herod the Great and Miriam, the last Jewish princess of the Hasmonean kings of Judea. Herod was not Jewish, but Miriam's children by him were considered Jews because she was. Drusilla's brother, Herod Agrippa II, gave her in marriage to Gaius Julius Azizus, priest king of Emesa, an Armenian kingdom in the Roman province of Syria. Azizus was a Gentile, but in order to obtain this desirable Jewish princess, he consented to be converted and was circumcised. A few years later, Felix was entranced by her beauty and persuaded her to commit adultery by leaving her husband and marrying him. So this is the kind of thing that happened all the time in this country. She was about 22 years of age at this time when she appeared at Felix's side during Paul's testimony at Caesarea. And he probably had her there because of her Jewish roots, to help him judge what Paul was saying and how it fit into what the Jews were saying. Felix, of course, became uncomfortable when Paul spoke about the necessity of living a righteous and self-restrained life in order to be prepared for God's judgment, because Felix was, of course, guilty on both counts. What Paul said was not good politics, but it was good pastoral counseling. So, had he not been quite so vociferous, maybe Felix might have been a little bit more open to him. But judging your captor is not a good thing. An ancient manuscript containing the text of Acts records that Drusilla instigated the sessions with Paul, but added that when Felix was not responsive to Paul's message, that it was her request Paul remained in prison. Acts gives no further information about her life, so it could be that she did not want the Jews to kill him. If Felix had released him, most likely they would have had another plot to kill him. So again, he always seemed to have found someone to protect him wherever he was. 2 years in captivity. Now again, there are two questions that could be asked. Why didn't the church in Jerusalem help out? Another 2 years have gone by. They must know where he is. Nothing happened. They didn't offer a bribe. They didn't do anything. And what did Paul do for those 2 years? There's no good answer to the first question. But as for the second, Paul probably continued his mission by spreading the gospel and teaching of the church. Remember, he was allowed visitors. People were allowed to come see him. He just couldn't leave. Plus Luke and them would have been with him, so they could come and go and bring people to him and then take them out again. So he was probably still doing his missionary work. So it's not like the church didn't know where he was or didn't know what was going on. So you can't say, well, he's in Caesarea, they forgot about him and he fell out of the picture, nobody heard about him again. Not true. So Paul would continue his mission. He spreads the gospel and teaching of the church. The faithful from Judea, Samaria, and Phoenicia were able to visit Paul and receive the same Christological teaching that is present in his surviving 14 letters. So this is where he was writing, he was doing other things. So these 2 years were productive years. He didn't just sit there hoping to be freed.
Is there a centralized leadership?
Is there
a centralized leadership in the church?
James. In this particular area, James was the bishop, the head guy, the authority. He took over when Peter had to flee for his life. St. Peter's now living in Rome. He's the head guy. So if they really had any questions appeal to Peter, he would have put a judgment over James. See, they didn't even do that. So because they didn't want Peter interfering in this. So it's a difficult thing. Yeah. James had the jurisdiction. He had the power. If he said we have to go help Paul, they would have had to help Paul. But why didn't he? Let's ask yourself that. Why didn't he? 2 years in prison. Why has no Christian tried to help him? They knew Felix. They knew he was open for bribes. Why wouldn't they bribe him, take Paul, and even spirit him out of the country? Send him to Rome, like they did Peter.
Would it be maybe to show that God is helping him?
That's kind of convenient if you think, oh, I won't do this because It'll show how God is helping him. I'd be a little suspicious about myself then, as to why I'm just letting myself off the hook. So they knew what was going on. He is a witness. He is an apostle. He has visions of Christ. They can't ignore him, yet they do. It's an odd thing.
Do you know the answer, or?
We don't know. We don't know why. Nothing's ever been written as to why they did not help. But that's what makes it so interesting. Nothing says that they did help either. So you're left in limbo. All this is going on. They made him do the ritual purity and all that and put him into the temple. But as soon as that caused a problem, they backed away from him. Nothing is heard from them since. He did everything they wanted him to do. He did the ritual purification. They could have gone to the Sanhedrin and said, no, here's proof that he did what he was supposed to do. He's purified before he went into the temple. He took nobody with him. There was no Gentile in the temple with him. That was just somebody's remark. But they did nothing.
So purification is
No, it just shows you that Paul was doing everything they asked him to do, but what were they doing for Paul? But then why did they have the Council of Jerusalem that said, you do not have to be circumcised? Why wasn't James upholding that in his own church? See? Questions are hard. It's easy to say that when Paul's way off in Greece somewhere, out of your hair. But when he comes back to Jerusalem, they're faced with, wait a second, we have now the first church council says this. And James even says, we're not telling them they have to be circumcised, we're just telling these certain things. But at the same time, they're not letting the Gentiles into the church in the same way as the Jewish ones are. So they're being treated second class. And Paul says, no, we're all one. It's a tough thing.
I think that we have to always remember that this is the time before the revolution was operating. Mm-hmm. And there was also a Jewish hierarchy. Mm-hmm. So how James coped with Jewish hierarchy and Roman hierarchy is very mysterious for me.
Yes. But there we have the old question of compromise. And do you compromise the gospel to save your own self or your own church? Is James compromising the gospel of Jesus Christ by saying the Gentiles are not on the same level as the Jewish Christians? It's also about the witness. Paul's also a Jew. He understands all that, but he doesn't compromise. It's a difficult thing. We all have to face these own questions in our own life. Jesus stood up against him, was murdered. Stephen stood up against him, was murdered. So is James afraid? You got to be careful. You can't say it's okay because he has this outside pressure on him. No, you have to deal with that outside pressure in light of the gospel. James has martyred himself. Things happen. He's martyred in the destruction of Jerusalem. He doesn't survive it.
It wouldn't really necessarily be, for example, the Jews wanted to maintain a certain position, and they believe the Lord the same way I do, and the Gentiles don't concern. But I don't think that's really a big deal.
No, for the Jews it isn't. But then the Jews are saying themselves, saying, well, if we're doing it, the Gentiles have to do it. And Paul's not sticking up for the Gentiles. Because there's so few of them there in Jerusalem, it's not a big deal to him. But now he's faced with Paul being there, who was the champion of the Gentile Christian and the Jew. If Paul was a Gentile, none of this would be going on. The fact that he's a Jew as well.
But he still has circumcised as well, even the district.
Yes.
So he was sort of playing the game.
No, he didn't. He wasn't playing the game. But what he went along with James with his ritual purity only because he's trying to keep harmony within the church. But he didn't say he was right. He did it because the bishop of Jerusalem has a higher authority than him. So he took the authority and he did it. Showed obedience. But he only took that so far. He's not going to ever say, Jews, the Gentiles have to be circumcised. Never going to say that. No matter what. And the one person he had circumcised, he was Jewish. So to give him credence in the Jewish synagogue.
And the only thing I have heard from James, that's what he was doing, I feel that it was probably easier, it was sort of an easier way, an easier path to use to become Christian. To maintain a covenant tradition.
But is that really what we want to do? Make an easy path to Christianity? By compromising? Make it easier? Yes, he was. He's ignoring the fact that they have an agreement that says the Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. He's ignoring that. He won't stand up for them in Jerusalem. He won't stand up for Paul, who's the champion of the Gentiles. You see it. Nowhere in here he stood up. Yeah, it's compromise. Political expediency.
That comes to Jerusalem was for the Gentiles only. And the Jews would keep their own traditions and customs going.
Okay, so
That's the thing.
see, already you've broken the church into two. I know this is the conundrum. This is how we tend to think. That's all I'm trying to get you to think. There's something going on here that we don't really understand why. That the church is now two. And the only way they get through this, unfortunately, destruction of Jerusalem. Then it all changes. Then everybody's back in one again. See, that's unfortunate. So you can say, well, that's the prophetic thing. All these circumstances led to that. Well, it's really interesting to look at all of this. You have to. It's not a simple story. None of it's ever simple.
Basically, Paul, it's like a POW.
He's not a prisoner of war because he's not really in a prison. He's in house arrest. He's in a house, comfortable. He gets his comfort, his food. People come and see him. He can visit with family, friends, and teach, and nobody's stopping him from doing that. He just can't leave Caesarea. He's under the protection of the Roman government, the Roman citizens. So they're bound to keep him. Yes, it is working in his favor. Yeah, because he'd be dead by this time if it wasn't for that. Because as I said, nobody else is protecting him. So it's odd that now the Romans are protecting him. Yeah, that's right. But isn't that part of God's hand here? If his own church won't help him or protect him, then he has to use the other side. Yeah.
So is James in a sense guilty of to preserve his own power?
We don't know that. I don't think so. I think James was struggling to find a way to unite this church, and he just couldn't find it. I mean, the picture got so big and so out of hand that he found it difficult to move within it. I don't want to ever say that James was a bad person, because he's a saint as well. It's just that he got caught on one side of the fence and was finding it very hard to get to the other side. He believed in what Paul said. He supported Paul at the Council of Jerusalem. He doesn't want the Gentiles to have to go through circumcision. But then he's got his own people. He's trying to bring them along, maybe too slowly, without confrontation. He doesn't want to cause any more problems. But unfortunately, that caused problems for Paul. Yeah. Exactly, and then that was it. Like I said, it's like a generation or so, and then it petered out. Oh yeah. Because whatever Jews escaped and got outside the city, and all the Jews from all around had to also then think about this whole question. But you see, but what was in their favor then, there was no seat of power anymore for the Jews. So the Gentiles now were in charge. Yeah. and the church grew through the Gentiles, and the Jewish church diminished, Jewish Christian church, because it all started to get thrown in together. Then when the persecution came, that kind of did a lot of work too. Yeah. Again, under persecution, it united the church again. Okay, so now, where am I? Felix left Paul in prison, right? Okay. Oh, yeah. We're talking about what Paul was doing while he was in prison. One of the letters attributed him as the letter to the Hebrews. It was probably written around this time. Testament letter is unlike all his other letters. It's not addressed to any particular faith community because he wasn't involved in any particular faith community. He was not allowed to leave where he was. People had to come to him. So this is a particular letter they can say is Paul in flavor, but written by somebody else because Paul didn't have access to a community. People would probably come, heard his sermons, heard his talks, started writing them down so they can take them from there out into the communities themselves. So as I said, it's not addressed to any particular faith community like all his other letters are. It presents itself as an address to Jews, to Hebrews, and most Bible scholars see this document as a homily instead of a letter. It's probably a homily Paul gave to the Jewish Christians of the Jerusalem church that was then copied down and circulated among other faith communities across Asia Minor and Greece. It may have been an address he made to the Jerusalem church that week he was in Jerusalem before he was arrested, or it could be cobbled together from his talks in these 2 years that he was languishing in Caesarea. In the address, he presents Jesus as the high priest, the heavenly sanctuary, and of the everlasting covenant. It is a covenant, he contends, that has fulfilled and made invalid the rituals of the old covenant. These are arguments that addressed his differences with the doctrine of James and the presbyters of the Jerusalem church concerning the old covenant ritual law. So it's kind of putting his case out there when nobody else is actually listening to him. So, now I'm back, stuck here again. Because we waited too long. Come on. Move there. Oh, no, I'm too far. There. 3 days after his arrival in the province, the new governor Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and Jewish leaders presented him their formal charges against Paul. They asked him as a favor to have him sent to Jerusalem, but they were plotting to kill him along the way, so they hadn't forgotten about him. Festus replied that Paul was being held in custody in Caesarea and that he himself would be returning there shortly. He said, "Let your authorities come down with me, and if this man has done something improper, let them accuse him." So, after 2 years, why are the Jews still determined to kill Paul? Been locked up for 2 years. If it wasn't, though, because he was still influencing others in this teaching about Christ, still having an impact on Jews and bringing about conversion. And that was making them mad. Even in prison, he's still converting people to give up the ritual ways and the laws, so they still, after 2 years, still want him dead. So, Paul was continuing to make trouble for them. They plot to kill him rather than accuse him and try him in court of law because they do not have adequate grounds to demand death penalty for him. They know that. Even though he wants good relations with the Jewish religious leaders, to his credit, Festus does not give in to them. He doesn't agree immediately, say, yeah, here he is, you can have him, I don't care. So he does not agree to turn them over. Oh, non-stop doing this. Okay, after spending no more than 8 or 10 days with them, he went down to Caesarea, and on the following day took his seat on the tribunal and ordered that Paul be brought in. When he appeared, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem surrounded him and brought many serious charges against him, which they were unable to prove. In defending himself, Paul said, I have committed no crime, either against the Jewish law, or against the temple, or against Caesar. Then Festus, willing to ingratiate himself with the Jews, he wants to kind of placate them as well, said to Paul in reply, Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there stand trial before me on these charges? Paul answered, I am standing before the tribunal of Caesar. This is where I should be tried. I have committed no crime against the Jews, as you very well know. If I have committed a crime or done anything deserving death, I do not seek to escape the death penalty. But if there is no substance to the charges they are bringing against me, then no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, after conferring with his council, replied, You have appealed to Caesar you will go. So he bests those people in Jerusalem, and he gets to go to Rome. Paul refuses to turn himself over because he knows he won't get a fair trial in Jerusalem. So, according to his right as a Roman citizen, he appeals his case to the jurisdiction of the Roman emperor. In this way, Paul broke this deadlock between the protective custody of the Roman governor and the plan of the chief priests to kill him. Caesar at this time is the infamous Nero, who assumed the throne after his mother, Agrippina the Younger, poisoned his stepfather, Emperor Claudius. There was a lot of poisoning. Agrippina the Younger murdered a lot of people. She used poison quite freely in her time, and in the end was killed by her own son, Nero, because she tried to kill him. Yeah. A very, very odd group of people, these Roman emperors. Okay, and Claudius was her own uncle, just so you know. She married him anyway. Oh, okay, we're going on from here. Is that where I am? Yes, there we go. When a few days had passed, King Agrippa, again, Agrippina is the female version of that name. Agrippa and Bernice is how you say it, not Bernice. I know, it took me a while. I looked up this. Well, I was saying Bernice, and then I was looking at one reference, and it says actually it's either Bernice or Bernice. That's how the Romans would have said it. So, Bernice arrived in Caesarea on a visit to Festus. Since they spent several days there, Festus referred Paul's case to the king, saying, There is a man here left in custody by Felix. When I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and demanded his condemnation. I answered them that it was not Roman practice to hand over an accused person before he has faced his accusers and had the opportunity to defend himself against their charge. So when they came together here, I made no delay. The next day I took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought in. His accusers stood around him, but did not charge him with any of the crimes I suspected. Instead, they had some issues with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, but who Paul claimed was alive. Since I was at a loss how to investigate this controversy, I asked if he were willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these charges. And when Paul appealed that he be held in custody for the Roman emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. Agrippina said to Festus, I too should like to hear this man. He replied, Tomorrow you will hear him. So, King Herod Agrippa and Bernice, whatever you want to say it, have decided to visit the new Roman governor. How does one entertain out-of-town guests? If you have a notorious prisoner, you invite your guests to interview him. Festus tells him that Paul's accusers did come to Caesarea to accuse him, but as in the case, Romans are not interested in religious disagreement. To Festus's credit, he did not turn Paul loose, only to be taken by the Jews. Instead, he upholds his rights as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar. So King Agrippa expresses the desire to hear Paul speak about his release. So got a dinner party. Good, I got this crazy prisoner, my prisoner. What do you think? Oh, I'd like to talk to him. That's kind of what this whole thing is, to just entertain his guests. He brings us all out, and here we go. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great ceremony and entered the audience hall in the company of cohort commanders and the prominent men of the city, and by command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all you here present with us, look at this man about whom the whole Jewish populace petitioned me here and in Jerusalem, clamoring that he should live no longer. He's really building it up. I found, however, that he had done nothing deserving death, and so when he appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. But I have nothing definite to write about him to our sovereign. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and particularly before you, King Agrippa, so that I may have something to write as a result of this investigation. For it seems senseless to me to send up a prisoner without indicating the charges against him. So this is the funniest thing. The Romans don't think there's anything wrong with this guy, yet they won't set him free. They won't just let him go. So there you are. Now, the one thing you see here is the Romans worshipped many gods. They respected the gods of all the nations that they conquered. So they were very hesitant to get into disputes of a religious nature. It's beyond the governor's comprehension, while Paul's slightly different views about the God of the Jews should cause all this upset. He doesn't see it's a little internal religious thing. Why is it causing all this problem? He doesn't get it. He hopes that this Jewish king, Agrippa, will shed some light on the problem. And then he can then explain it better to Nero, because he is hesitant to send someone to Nero who has no charges and waste the emperor's time. It wouldn't look so good for him. So he's hoping this Jewish king and his wife can give him something to put down as a charge. So that's where we're going to leave it, and next week he's off to Rome. I do have the handout for you today.